The piercing crack of a wooden gavel sliced through the humid August air, as Abigail Montgomery struggled against the ropes binding her wrists, her honey-colored hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders. The auction block beneath her feet felt like a stage of shame, erected in the center of Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory. 1878, a place where the law was just a whispered suggestion, and men like Silas Warner made their own rules. $500 for this fine specimen, the auctioneer called out, gesturing to Abigail as if she were nothing more than a prized mare. Look at her, gentlemen, strong, healthy, and educated too, perfect for any man needing a wife or a worker. Abigail blinked back tears, refusing to let the crowd of leering men see her break. 22 years of life hadn't prepared her for this moment, being sold to pay her late father's debts, a practice outlawed in most civilized parts of the country, but somehow still thriving in this lawless corner of the Arizona Territory. 550, called a portly man with a greasy beard, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. 600, countered another voice, belonging to a thin, rat-faced man whose reputation for cruelty toward his ranch hands was well known throughout the county. Abigail's heart sank further with each bid. Her father's passing 3 months ago had left her vulnerable to Warner's schemes. He'd forged loan documents, claimed her father owed him a small fortune, and when she couldn't pay, he'd found a territorial judge corrupt enough to approve this barbaric solution. Her protests had fallen on deaf ears in a town where Warner's money spoke louder than justice. $800, called out a new voice, belonging to a silver-haired rancher whose wrinkled face suggested he was approaching 70. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 men now, gathered in the town square on this sweltering afternoon, their attention fixed on the spectacle before them. A few women stood at the edges, their faces pinched with disapproval, but none dared speak out against Warner's influence. 900, shouted the rat-faced man, his thin lips curling into a triumphant smile. Abigail closed her eyes, trying to imagine herself anywhere but here. She'd had plans, dreams of continuing her father's work as the town's only schoolteacher. Now those dreams seemed as distant as the mountains that rimmed the horizon. $1,000, a gravelly voice called from the back of the crowd. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. $1,000 from Mr. Hargrove. Do I hear any? A commotion at the edge of the gathering interrupted him. The crowd parted reluctantly as a tall figure pushed through, the jingle of spurs accompanying each determined step. Abigail's eyes snapped open at the disturbance, hope flickering faintly for the first time since this nightmare began. The man who emerged was dust-covered from the trail, his dark hat pulled low over his eyes. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to handling himself in difficult situations. When he finally lifted his head, Abigail caught a glimpse of piercing blue eyes set in a sun-bronzed face. "This ends right now," he declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. The auctioneer recovered first. "Sir, we're conducting legitimate business here." "Mr. Warner has legal papers. I said it ends," the stranger repeated, reaching the base of the auction platform in 3 long strides. His hand rested casually on the holstered Colt at his hip, but the gesture contained an unmistakable threat. "There's nothing legitimate about selling a human being." Silas Warner stepped forward, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the newcomer's trail-worn clothes. "Lucas Preston," he spat the name like it was poison. "You've got no authority here. This woman's father owed me money, and the territorial court has approved this settlement." Lucas Preston. The name stirred something in Abigail's memory. Stories of a former lawman turned bounty hunter who'd earned a reputation for finding justice where others couldn't or wouldn't. That's so, Lucas replied, his voice deceptively soft as he pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Because I've got a federal document here saying those debts were paid in full 6 months ago, and a warrant for your arrest on charges of forgery and fraud. Warner. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Warner's face paled, then flushed with anger. This is preposterous, Sheriff Dobbs, Warner called to the town's lawman who stood uncomfortably at the edge of the gathering. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his gun. I don't know about any federal warrants, Preston. Then perhaps you'd like to explain to the federal marshal who's riding in tomorrow why you're allowing human auction in violation of federal law, Lucas suggested, his gaze never leaving Warner. Or maybe you'd prefer to tell him why you're interfering with a duly appointed deputy U.S. Marshal. He pulled back his vest to reveal a silver star pinned to his shirt. The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Warner's confidence visibly faltered. This is my town, Preston. You can't just ride in here and it's the United States government's territory, Lucas corrected him. And I'm cutting this young lady loose right now. He climbed the steps to the platform in 2 strides, pulling a knife from his boot. Abigail held perfectly still as he approached, uncertain whether this unexpected intervention would lead to salvation or simply a different kind of trouble. But when his eyes met hers, she saw something there beyond determination, compassion, perhaps, or understanding. Hold steady, miss, he said quietly as he sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. You're not merchandise to be sold. The feeling that rushed back into her fingers was painful, but the relief of being freed overwhelmed the discomfort. Lucas turned to face the crowd, positioning himself slightly in front of Abigail. This auction is over, he announced. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. The challenge hung in the air. Sheriff Dobbs looked to Warner, who was calculating his options with visible desperation. This isn't over, Preston, Warner finally growled. You've made a powerful enemy today. Lucas didn't flinch. Wouldn't be the first time. He turned back to Abigail. Miss, if you'll come with me, I'll see you safely home. Abigail hesitated only a moment before nodding. Whatever this man's intentions, they couldn't be worse than the fate that had awaited her moments ago. As Lucas helped her down from the platform, the crowd began to disperse, men muttering among themselves. Warner stormed away, flanked by 2 burly ranch hands. Sheriff Dobbs approached cautiously. Preston, I'll need to see those papers, he said, a hint of authority returning to his voice now that the immediate confrontation had passed. Lucas handed over the documents without argument. Take your time, Sheriff. I'll be staying in town for a while. Miss Montgomery needs protection until this matter is properly settled. The sheriff scanned the papers, his expression growing increasingly troubled. These look legitimate, he admitted reluctantly. That's because they are, Lucas replied. Now, if you'll excuse us. He offered his arm to Abigail, who took it gratefully, her legs still shaky beneath her. As they walked away from the auction block, she found her voice at last. How did you know my name? She asked, suddenly realizing he had called her Miss Montgomery without introduction. A faint smile touched his lips. Your father hired me 6 months ago when Warner first started making trouble. I've been tracking this case for some time. My father, Abigail stopped walking, forcing Lucas to pause as well, but he never mentioned. Daniel Montgomery was a cautious man. He suspected Warner was forging loan documents but needed proof. I found it, got the debts officially cleared, but I was delayed returning. His expression darkened. I'm sorry I didn't make it back before he passed. Abigail processed this information, emotions warring within her relief at her rescue, grief for her father, confusion about this stranger who seemed to know so much about her family's troubles. "Why would you continue investigating after my father died?" she asked. Lucas's blue eyes held her steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because your father was a good man who helped me once when I needed it. I owe him." Before she could ask more questions, a shout from behind them drew their attention. One of Warner's men was approaching, hand hovering near his gun. "This isn't finished," the man growled. "Mr. Warner wants a word with the lady." Lucas stepped smoothly between Abigail and the threat. "The lady isn't available." "Tell Warner if he has something to say. He can say it to me, preferably in front of witnesses and the law." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before the man backed down, spitting in the dust near Lucas's boots before turning away. "We should get you somewhere safe," Lucas said, his voice low. "Warner won't give up easily." Abigail nodded, suddenly aware of how exposed they were in the middle of the street. "My father's house, our house, is at the edge of town, but Warner may have men watching it." "Then we'll go to the hotel first," Lucas decided. "I need to make arrangements anyway." As they walked toward Dusty Creek's only hotel, Abigail felt the stares of townspeople following them. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few openly hostile. She'd lived in this town her entire life, taught many of their children, and yet few had spoken up when Warner had her dragged to that auction block. "They were afraid," Lucas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Warner has owned this town for years, but that's about to change." The Grand Western Hotel was the tallest building in Dusty Creek, a 3-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, the lobby was mercifully cool after the August heat. The clerk behind the desk straightened when they entered. "Mr. Preston, your room is ready as requested." "Room 201. Lucas nodded his thanks, then turned to Abigail. "I'll arrange a separate room for you, Miss Montgomery." "That won't be necessary," came a firm female voice from the staircase. "Abigail will stay with me." Eleanor Bailey, the hotel owner's widow and one of the few women in town who'd shown Abigail kindness after her father's death, descended the stairs with determination in her stride. In her 50s, with steel-gray hair and an equally steely disposition, she was perhaps the only person in Dusty Creek whom even Silas Warner treated with a measure of respect. "Mrs. Bailey," Abigail said with relief. "I don't want to impose nonsense," Eleanor cut her off. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to Warner for years. It's about time." She looked Lucas up and down appraisingly. "Marshal Preston, is it?" "Deputy Marshal," he corrected, "and only temporarily commissioned for this particular case." Eleanor nodded as if this confirmed something for her. "Well, Deputy, you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Warner won't take this lying down." "I'm counting on it," Lucas replied. "The more he fights, the more evidence he provides for the case against him." Eleanor turned to Abigail. "Come, dear, you need to rest and clean up." "I've drawn a bath in my private quarters." Abigail hesitated, looking at Lucas. "What happens now?" "Now you get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll retrieve your belongings from your home and make sure Warner's men haven't disturbed anything. The federal marshal arriving tomorrow will want to take your statement as part of the case against Warner." "And after that?" she asked, suddenly uncertain about her future. Her teaching position had effectively ended with her father's death, as Warner had made sure the school board didn't renew her contract. Lucas's expression softened slightly. "One step at a time, Miss Montgomery. For now, you're safe, and Warner's days of running this town are numbered." There was something reassuring in his quiet confidence that made Abigail believe him, despite the odds they faced. She nodded and allowed Eleanor to lead her upstairs, glancing back once to see Lucas watching them ascend, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. The hot bath Alina had prepared was the first real comfort Abigail had experienced in weeks. As she soaked, letting the water wash away the dust and fear of the auction block, she found herself thinking about the mysterious marshal who had appeared just when all hope seemed lost. There was something about him that suggested he carried his own burdens, his own story that had led him to this moment of intersection with hers. Later, dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe, Abigail sat by the window in Alina's spare bedroom, watching the street below as evening descended on Dusty Creek. The town seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath in anticipation of what tomorrow might bring. A soft knock at the door preceded Alina's entrance, carrying a tray with tea and sandwiches. "You need to eat, dear," she said firmly. "Starving yourself won't solve anything." Abigail hadn't realized how hungry she was until the aroma of fresh bread and ham reached her. She ate gratefully while Alina settled into a chair nearby. "That young marshal," Alina began conversationally. "He's quite something, isn't he?" Abigail looked up from her plate. "I owe him my freedom, possibly my life." "Indeed." Alina sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Do you know his story?" Abigail shook her head. "He mentioned that my father helped him once, but nothing more." Alina nodded. "I remember when Preston first came through Dusty Creek, about 5 years ago. He was barely more than a boy then, despite having already earned a reputation as a capable lawman. He'd been shot ambushed by outlaws he was tracking. Your father found him on the trail and brought him to the doctor." Abigail vaguely recalled her father being absent for several days, claiming he was helping a sick friend. "He never told me." "Your father was a private man when it came to his good deeds," Alina said with a sad smile. "Preston recovered and continued his hunt, brought in all 3 outlaws alive to stand trial from what I heard." She paused. "There's more to his story, but perhaps that's for him to tell if he chooses." Abigail's curiosity was piqued, but she respected the older woman's discretion. "Do you think he can really stand against Warner? The man practically owns the territory from here to Tucson." Alina's expression hardened. "Warner owns people through fear and money. But men like Preston, they're cut from different cloth. They're the kind who stand on principle even when it costs them." She stood, gathering the empty plates. "Get some rest, dear. Tomorrow will be a challenging day." As Abigail slipped between the cool sheets, her mind whirled with the events of the day: the humiliation of the auction block, the unexpected rescue, and the enigmatic marshal who had appeared like a character from one of the dime novels. She occasionally indulged in reading. But this was no fiction, she reminded herself. The danger was real, and Warner would not easily surrender his power or his pride. With that sobering thought, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, where blue eyes and the words "this ends right now" chased her through dreams of rope bonds and auction blocks. Morning brought a clarity that had been absent in the chaos of the previous day. Abigail woke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains, momentarily disoriented before remembering she was in Alina Bailey's guest room. The events at the auction block came flooding back, but in the light of day, they seemed almost surreal. She dressed in clothes Alina had provided, a simple blue dress that was slightly too large but clean and presentable. When she descended to the hotel's dining room, she found Preston already there, nursing a cup of coffee and studying papers spread before him. He rose when she approached, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy. "Miss Montgomery, I trust you slept well." "As well as could be expected," she answered honestly, noting the dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't rested much himself. "Have there been any developments?" Lucas glanced around the nearly empty dining room before answering in a low voice. Warner's men have been watching the hotel all night. 2 in front, 1 in the alley behind. His tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than potential threats. Abigail's stomach tightened with anxiety. "What does that mean for our plans?" "It means we proceed carefully," he replied, folding the papers and tucking them into his vest pocket. "The federal marshal should arrive by noon. Until then, we stay where there are witnesses." A waitress appeared with coffee for Abigail and a plate of eggs and bacon for Lucas. After taking Abigail's breakfast order, she hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with their presence. "The town is divided," Lucas observed, cutting into his eggs. "Some folks are relieved someone's finally standing up to Warner. Others are worried about what happens if his grip on the town loosens." "And which are you?" Abigail asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Lucas looked up, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "I'm just doing my job, Miss Montgomery. Please call me Abigail," she said. "After yesterday, formality seems rather pointless." He nodded slightly. "Abigail, then." He hesitated before adding, "And I suppose you should call me Lucas, at least when we're not in public." There was something in the way he said her name, a softness that contrasted with his otherwise reserved demeanor that made her pause. Before she could respond, the dining room door swung open and Sheriff Dobbs entered, looking harried. He approached their table directly, removing his hat. "Preston, Miss Montgomery." He nodded to each of them in turn. "I need a word." Lucas gestured to an empty chair. "Have a seat, Sheriff." Dobbs remained standing. "Privately." "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Miss Montgomery," Lucas replied evenly. "This concerns her as much as anyone." The sheriff glanced nervously at the few other diners before lowering his voice. "Warner's pressing charges against you for interfering with legal proceedings. Claims you assaulted his men during the auction." Lucas calmly took another bite of his breakfast. "Interesting approach. And your response to these charges?" Dobbs shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not taking sides here, Preston. Just delivering the message that he wants to see you in my office at 10 o'clock to discuss terms." "Terms," Lucas repeated, his voice hardening slightly. "Tell Warner I'll be there, but the only terms we'll be discussing are the ones that involve him surrendering peacefully to federal custody when Marshal Davis arrives." The sheriff's face paled. "You're playing a dangerous game, Preston. Warner doesn't make idle threats." "Neither do I," Lucas replied. "And unlike Warner, I have the full weight of federal law behind me." After Dobbs departed, Abigail leaned forward. "Is it wise to meet with him? It could be a trap." "Almost certainly is," Lucas agreed, finishing his coffee. "But sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to walk into it knowingly." "That's not particularly reassuring," Abigail said, her breakfast forgotten. Lucas's expression softened slightly. "I've been dealing with men like Warner for most of my adult life. They rely on intimidation because it usually works. When it doesn't," he shrugged, "they rarely know what to do next. And if he decides that violence is the answer," she pressed, "then he'll discover I'm better at it than he is." The calm certainty in his voice sent a chill down Abigail's spine. This was a man who understood the darker realities of the frontier in ways she had been sheltered from, despite living here her entire life. As promised, at 10 o'clock precisely, Lucas made his way to the sheriff's office with Abigail at his side. He had tried to convince her to stay at the hotel with Alina, but she had insisted on accompanying him. "If this concerns my future, I should be present," she had argued. "I'm tired of men making decisions about my life without my input." He had conceded the point with surprising grace, though he positioned himself between her and any potential danger as they walked the dusty main street. Townspeople stopped to stare, some nodding respectfully, others turning away as if not wanting to be seen acknowledging them. The sheriff's office was a small, square building adjacent to the two-cell jailhouse. When they entered, they found not only Sheriff Dobbs and Silas Warner, but also Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate who had approved the auction. Warner rose from his chair, his face flushing with anger at the sight of Abigail. "What is she doing here? This is a legal matter between men." "Miss Montgomery is the aggrieved party," Lucas replied coolly. "She has every right to be present for discussions concerning her welfare." The judge cleared his throat nervously. "Yes, well, perhaps we can all sit down and discuss this civilly." Lucas guided Abigail to a chair before taking one himself, positioning it so he could keep an eye on both the door and Warner. The tension in the room was palpable. "I've reviewed the documents you presented yesterday, Preston," Judge Harrison began. "If they're authentic, they would indeed invalidate the debt claim against Daniel Montgomery's estate." "If," Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Those documents bear the seal of the territorial governor and federal district court. Are you questioning their authenticity, Judge?" Harrison paled slightly. No, merely establishing the facts of the case." Warner slammed his fist on the desk. "This is absurd. I have a legitimate claim that this court recognized. You can't just ride in with some papers and overturn settled law." "There's nothing settled about fraud," Lucas replied evenly. "And nothing lawful about selling human beings, regardless of the circumstances. The auction was merely a creative solution to settle a valid debt," Warner insisted. "Miss Montgomery was not being sold into slavery, simply contracting her labor to repay what her father owed." Abigail could no longer contain her anger. "Against my will, bound like an animal to be purchased by the highest bidder with no say in my fate. How is that different from slavery?" Warner dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Women are always dramatic about business matters they don't understand." Lucas's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Miss Montgomery was a respected schoolteacher with a university education. I suspect she understands quite well what was happening." His eyes narrowed. "And so do you, Warner, which is why you're facing federal charges for violation of the 13th Amendment, among other things." The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Perhaps we could reach some accommodation that satisfies all parties." "Mr. Warner is an important man in this territory, with friends in the governor's office. Are you suggesting we circumvent federal law because of Warner's political connections?" Lucas asked quietly, the dangerous undertone in his voice causing the judge to blanch. Before Harrison could respond, the office door opened, and a tall man in a dust-covered duster entered, a federal marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. "Marshal Davis," Lucas acknowledged with a nod. "You're right on time." The newcomer surveyed the room with experienced eyes. "Seems I've arrived at an interesting moment. Sheriff Dobbs, Judge Harrison." He nodded to each man before his gaze settled on Warner. "And you must be Silas Warner. I've heard a great deal about you." Warner stood, attempting to regain his composure. "Marshal, this deputy of yours is disrupting legitimate legal proceedings and threatening a respected businessman with spurious charges." Davis removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a weathered face that had seen decades of frontier justice. "Is that so?" "Because from the telegrams I've received from the federal prosecutor's office, it sounds like you've been running quite an operation here, Mr. Warner. Forgery, fraud, intimidation, and now human trafficking." "This is outrageous," Warner sputtered. "I demand—" "You're not in a position to demand anything," Davis interrupted. From his pocket, he withdrew an official-looking document. "This is a federal warrant for your arrest, signed by the federal judge in Santa Fe. You're being charged with multiple violations of federal law." The color drained from Warner's face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He looked to the judge and sheriff, but both men had suddenly become very interested in examining the floorboards. "You can't do this," Warner said, his voice losing its confident edge. "I own this town." "And therein lies your problem," Davis replied. "Towns can't be owned, not in the United States. Not anymore." He turned to the sheriff. "Dobbs, I'm deputizing you under federal authority to assist in this arrest, unless you'd prefer to join Mr. Warner as a defendant." The sheriff swallowed hard before standing. "No, sir, I'm happy to assist federal officers." Warner's hand twitched toward his coat, a movement Lucas caught instantly. His own hand moved to his holster with practiced speed. "I wouldn't," he advised quietly. For a tense moment, Warner seemed to consider his options. Then, slowly, he raised his hands. "This isn't over," he growled. "I have friends you haven't even heard of." "They can visit you in the territorial prison," Davis replied dryly. "Sheriff, if you do the honors." As Dobbs nervously placed Warner in handcuffs, Judge Harrison rose. "Marshal, surely we can discuss this." "Mr. Warner has been a pillar of this community for—" "Judge Harrison," Davis cut him off. "A federal investigator will be reviewing all your recent rulings, particularly those involving Mr. Warner's interests. I suggest you consider very carefully whether you want to tie yourself more closely to his fate." He paused meaningfully. "Or perhaps you'd like to begin cooperating now." The judge's face went from red to white in rapid succession. That is. I've always sought to uphold the law as I understood it." "Then your understanding needs significant improvement," Davis replied. "We'll discuss this further once Warner is secured." As the sheriff led a fuming Warner toward the jail cells, Marshal Davis turned his attention to Abigail. "Miss Montgomery, I presume? Deputy Preston has told me about your ordeal. I'm sorry the federal authorities weren't able to intervene sooner." Abigail nodded, still processing the sudden reversal of fortune. "Will it really end this easily?" "Warner has controlled Dusty Creek for as long as I can remember. Nothing about dismantling Warner's operation will be easy," Davis admitted. "But this is the beginning of the end for him. We've been building this case for months, gathering evidence from multiple territories where he's operated." Lucas stood. "Miss Montgomery's house has likely been watched or possibly searched by Warner's men. We should check it as soon as possible." Davis nodded agreement. "Go ahead. I'll handle things here and meet you this evening to take Miss Montgomery's official statement." Outside, the news of Warner's arrest was already spreading through town, creating a buzz of excitement and apprehension. As Lucas and Abigail walked toward her home at the edge of town, she became aware of people watching them from windows and doorways, their expressions ranging from hopeful to hostile. "Everything's changing," she murmured, half to herself. Lucas glanced at her. Change was coming one way or another. Warner's type always pushed too far eventually. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the late morning sun beating down on the dusty street. Abigail found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, trying to reconcile the dangerous competence he had displayed with the occasional glimpses of gentleness she had witnessed. "You said my father helped you once," she said finally. "Mrs. Bailey mentioned you were injured." Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Ambushed by outlaws I was tracking, 3 brothers the Keller gang. They'd robbed banks across 2 territories, killed several people. I got careless, they got lucky." His hand unconsciously touched his side where Abigail guessed a scar remained. "Your father found me bleeding on the trail, brought me to town, and sat with me through the fever that followed. Wouldn't take payment when I offered it later." "That sounds like him," Abigail said softly, grief for her father surfacing unexpectedly. He believed in helping where he could. He spoke of you often during those days, Lucas continued, surprising her. How proud he was of your education, your teaching. Said you had your mother's spirit and determination. The mention of her mother, who had died when Abigail was 12, brought a lump to her throat. I didn't know he shared such things with strangers. Fever makes men talkative, Lucas replied with a slight smile. And I wasn't entirely a stranger by the end of it, when I heard about his death and then discovered Warner's scheme involving you. He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Let's just say, I requested this assignment specifically. They had reached the modest house where Abigail had grown up, a simple 2-story structure set back from the road, with a small garden that had begun to wilt from neglect. Lucas insisted on entering first, his hand resting on his holster as he checked each room methodically. Someone's been here, he called from her father's study. Recently. Abigail hurried to join him, dismayed to find her father's desk drawers hanging open, papers scattered across the floor. They were looking for something. The debt documents, most likely, Lucas agreed, kneeling to examine the mess. Warner probably wanted to destroy any evidence that might contradict his claims. Abigail began gathering the papers, trying to restore order to her father's belongings. As she worked, a thought occurred to her. If Warner is arrested, what happens to his businesses, his properties? Some will likely be seized as evidence or to repay those he's defrauded, Lucas explained, helping her sort through the documents. Others may go to relatives or business partners, depending on the arrangements. And the school? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He convinced the board to close it after father died, claiming the town couldn't afford it without his financial support. Lucas looked up, his expression softening at the concern in her voice. That's something the town will have to decide for itself once Warner's influence is removed. Do you want to continue teaching here? The question gave her pause. Until yesterday, her future had seemed predestined, either sold at auction or forced to leave the only home she'd ever known. Now, unexpectedly, she had choices again. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to stay and rebuild what Warner destroyed. Another part wonders if I could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without these memories. Lucas nodded, understanding. You don't have to decide immediately. The case against Warner will take time to work through the courts. You'll have options. They continued sorting through the papers, setting aside anything that might be relevant to the case against Warner. As they worked, Abigail became increasingly aware of Lucas's presence, the careful precision of his movements, the occasional brush of his hand against hers as they reached for the same document, the faint scent of leather and soap that surrounded him. What about you? She asked suddenly. After Warner's case is settled, where will you go? He glanced up, seeming surprised by the question. Back to my regular duties, I suppose. There's never a shortage of work for a marshal in these territories. Is that what you want? She pressed, curious about the man behind the badge. Endless pursuit of outlaws and fraudsters. A shadow crossed his face. It's what I'm good at, he said after a moment, which wasn't really an answer. Then, perhaps sensing her dissatisfaction with his response, he added, I had other plans once, a ranch in Colorado, but circumstances changed. Before she could ask more, they heard the front door open. Lucas was on his feet instantly, gun drawn, positioning himself between Abigail and the potential threat. Miss Montgomery, called a familiar voice. It's Alina Bailey. Marshal Davis sent me to check on you. Lucas relaxed, holstering his weapon as Alina appeared in the doorway of the study, a basket on her arm. I brought some lunch, she announced, surveying the mess with pursed lips. And it seems I came just in time. This will take hours to sort through. With Alina's help, they made quicker progress organizing the study. By mid-afternoon, they had filled a crate with documents that might be useful for the case and had restored some order to the rest. Abigail also packed a valise with personal belongings, uncertain when she might return to the house. As they prepared to leave, hoofbeats on the road outside drew Lucas to the window. His hand moved instinctively to his gun before relaxing. "It's Davis," he reported, "and he's not alone." Stepping onto the porch, they found the marshal accompanied by 3 riders, 2 men Abigail didn't recognize, and, surprisingly, Sheriff Dobbs, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Found these gentlemen at the edge of town, heading out in a hurry," Davis explained, gesturing to the strangers. "Warner's bookkeeper and his personal lawyer. They've decided it might be in their best interest to cooperate with our investigation." The smaller of the 2 men, thin and nervous with ink-stained fingers, spoke up. "Miss Montgomery, I want to apologize for my part in this. Mr. Warner. He can be very persuasive when he wants something." Abigail regarded him coolly. "Persuasive enough to justify selling a woman at auction," the man flinched. "No, madam, there's no justifying that. Which is why I'm willing to testify about the forged loan documents and other irregularities in Mr. Warner's business practices. We've secured the bank records as well," Davis added. "Between these gentlemen's testimony and the paper trail, Warner won't see freedom for many years." It should have felt like victory, Abigail thought, but instead she felt oddly hollow. Justice was being served, yet it wouldn't bring her father back or erase the humiliation she had endured on that auction block. As if sensing her thoughts, Lucas stepped closer, his presence steady beside her. "It's a start," he said quietly. "The rest takes time." They returned to town together, the small procession drawing stares from residents who were still trying to understand the sudden power shift in their community. At the hotel, Marshal Davis set up a temporary office in the dining room, taking statements from various witnesses to Warner's schemes. Abigail's own statement took over an hour, as she recounted everything from her father's death to the auction. Lucas remained nearby throughout, his silent support making the difficult task bearable. By evening, word had spread throughout Dusty Creek that Warner's empire was crumbling. 3 more of his associates had surrendered to Davis, offering information in exchange for leniency. The town council had convened an emergency meeting to discuss how to proceed now that their primary benefactor and tormentor was behind bars. Eleanor prepared a private dinner in her quarters for Abigail, Lucas, and Marshal Davis, away from the curious eyes of the townspeople. As they ate, Davis outlined the next steps in the case. "I'll be taking Warner and the primary conspirators to Santa Fe tomorrow for arraignment," he explained. "The trial probably won't happen for several months, but with the evidence we've gathered, conviction is all but certain." "What about the town in the meantime?" Abigail asked. "Warner controlled so much the bank, most of the businesses, even the water rights for the creek." Davis nodded. "That's where it gets complicated. The court will appoint trustees to manage his legitimate businesses until the case is resolved. The properties acquired through fraud will eventually be returned to their rightful owners or sold to repay his victims." "And Miss Montgomery's safety?" Lucas asked, his voice holding an edge of concern that hadn't been there earlier. "Warner will be in custody, but he still has friends," Davis acknowledged. "It would be prudent for Miss Montgomery to remain cautious until the trial is concluded." Abigail set down her fork. "You're suggesting I leave Dusty Creek?" "It might be the safest option," Davis said gently. "At least temporarily." The idea of leaving, of being forced from her home by Warner's lingering influence, sparked a determination in Abigail that overshadowed her earlier uncertainty. "No," she said firmly, "I won't be driven away." This is my home, and I intend to stay and help rebuild what Warner destroyed." Lucas studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read, respect, perhaps, mixed with concern. "It won't be easy," he warned. "There will be those in town who resent you for your role in Warner's downfall." "Easy wasn't what I had in mind," Abigail replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Justice was." A hint of a smile touched Lucas's lips. "Your father would be proud of that answer." Davis cleared his throat. "Well, if you're determined to stay, we should discuss security arrangements. I can request that a marshal be assigned to Dusty Creek temporarily, given the circumstances." "I'll stay," Lucas said before Abigail could respond. When Davis raised an eyebrow, he added, "My commission is flexible. I can remain here until things settle." The marshal considered this. "It's irregular, but given your familiarity with the case, I'll arrange it." He turned to Abigail. "Would that be acceptable to you, Miss Montgomery?" Abigail found herself oddly flustered by the question and by the intensity in Lucas's eyes as he awaited her answer. "Yes," she said finally. "That would be reassuring." After dinner, Davis excused himself to check on the prisoners, leaving Abigail and Lucas alone with Alina, who soon made a transparent excuse about needing to review the hotel accounts. In the sudden quiet of Alina's sitting room, Abigail was acutely aware of Lucas's presence the way he stood by the window, silhouetted against the deepening twilight, his profile strong and thoughtful. "You didn't have to volunteer to stay," she said at last. "I'm sure you have other duties, other cases." He turned from the window, his expression softening in the lamplight. "I told you I requested this assignment specifically. I intend to see it through properly." "Because you owed my father?" she asked, needing to understand his motivation. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "That's how it started," he admitted. "But now—" he seemed to struggle with the words. "Now I find I have additional reasons for wanting to ensure your safety and see justice done." The implication in his words sent an unexpected warmth through Abigail. She had been so focused on survival these past months that she had pushed aside any thought of personal connections, of a future beyond immediate concerns. Yet standing here with this man who had risked himself to save her, she found herself wondering about possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. "I should thank you properly," she said, moving closer to him, "for what you did yesterday, for saying those words that changed everything." His eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she pointed out softly. "You did." The moment stretched between them, filled with things neither was quite ready to say. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. "It's getting late. You should rest. Tomorrow will bring new challenges." Abigail nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his words even as part of her wish to prolong this quiet moment of connection. "Good night, then, Lucas." "Good night, Abigail," he replied, her name on his lips sounding like something precious, something to be carefully guarded. As she retired to her room, Abigail found herself thinking not of Warner or the case, or even her uncertain future in Dusty Creek, but of blue eyes that had looked at her with such unexpected tenderness, and the feeling that perhaps, after all the loss and fear, something new and hopeful might be beginning. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Dusty Creek. With Warner and his closest associates imprisoned awaiting trial, the town began the difficult process of disentangling itself from his influence. The bank reopened under temporary management. Businesses adjusted to the new reality, and townspeople who had long kept silent about Warner's abuses began to speak openly. Abigail threw herself into community efforts, helping to organize a committee to reopen the school and offering temporary lessons in the church while arrangements were made. Many parents who had previously been intimidated by Warner now eagerly enrolled their children, and Abigail found purpose in returning to the work she loved. Lucas remained in Dusty Creek as promised, taking a room at the hotel and establishing a temporary marshal's office in a vacant storefront. He worked methodically to document Warner's crimes, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence for the upcoming trial. In the evenings, he often joined Abigail for dinner at Alina's table, their conversations gradually expanding beyond the case to personal interests, hopes, and experiences. Abigail learned that Lucas had been born in Pennsylvania, had fought briefly in the closing days of the Civil War despite his youth, and had drifted west afterward, eventually finding his calling in law enforcement. He spoke little of family, and she sensed loss there but didn't press. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Dusty Creek, her time at the Women's College in Denver where she had trained as a teacher, and her dreams for the school. They discovered shared interests in literature and history, and Lucas revealed a surprising knowledge of educational theory that he attributed to reading whatever was available during long stakeouts. As September yielded to October, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light to the high desert, something else was changing too: the way they looked at each other, the frequency of accidental touches, the reluctance to end their evenings together. Abigail found herself thinking of Lucas at odd moments during her days, wondering what he might think of a particular book she was reading, or how he would react to the town council's latest decision. For his part, Lucas seemed to find increasingly creative reasons to visit the schoolroom, bringing supplies he thought might be useful or offering to repair the aging building's various defects. The children quickly grew accustomed to the tall marshal's presence, especially when he could be persuaded to tell carefully edited stories of his adventures tracking outlaws. It was after one such visit, as Lucas was helping Abigail clean the schoolroom at day's end, that a moment of significant change occurred between them. She had been reaching for a book on a high shelf when he moved to assist her, his body close behind hers, his arm extending alongside her own. When she turned, their faces were inches apart, his eyes darkening as they met hers. For a breathless moment, neither moved. Then, with infinite gentleness, Lucas brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering against her skin. "Abigail," he said, her name almost a question. "Yes," she answered, though he hadn't actually asked anything. He smiled then, a full smile unlike his usual reserved expressions, transforming his face in a way that made her heart skip. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, almost reverential, yet Abigail felt it echo through her entire being. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself as she responded, her initial hesitation giving way to certainty. When they finally parted, Lucas rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "What took you so long?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. He laughed softly. "Caution. Uncertainty about whether you might welcome such an advance. Concern about the propriety of it, given the circumstances of our meeting." "I think we're well past those circumstances now," she pointed out, her hand still resting on his shoulders, unwilling to break the connection between them. "Indeed we are," he agreed, his expression growing more serious. "Abigail, I should tell you, my commission here is temporary. Eventually, I'll be called back to my regular duties." The reminder of the provisional nature of their situation sobered her. "I understand," she said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "You have responsibilities elsewhere." His hands came up to frame her face, his touch impossibly gentle. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I need to consider my future more carefully now, because I find myself wanting things I hadn't allowed myself to want for a very long time. Hope bloomed in her chest. What things? Roots, he answered simply. A home. A purpose beyond the next case or the next criminal. His thumbs traced delicate patterns on her cheeks. You. The directness of his admission took her breath away. Lucas, we've known each other barely a month, and yet I feel I know you better than people I've known for years, he countered. I'm not proposing marriage this instant, Abigail. I'm just telling you that I see possibilities with you that I want to explore if you're willing. In his eyes, she saw the same longing for connection, for understanding that she had felt growing in herself these past weeks. I'm willing, she said softly. More than willing. The second kiss was deeper than the first, a promise between them of possibilities to come. When they finally separated, the schoolroom had grown dim with twilight, and they realized how much time had passed. Eleanor will be wondering where we are, Abigail said, gathering her things. Lucas nodded, helping her with her shawl. And I have rounds to make before evening. At the doorway, he paused. Have dinner with me tomorrow, not at Eleanor's, at the new restaurant that opened on Main Street, a proper dinner, just the two of us. I'd like that, she agreed, warmth spreading through her at the prospect. As October progressed into November, their relationship deepened. They established a routine of dinners together most evenings, walks on Abigail's free afternoons, and quiet conversations by the fire in Eleanor's sitting room, which she tactfully made available to them, while maintaining propriety by her occasional presence nearby. The town, observing this developing romance, reacted with generally positive interest. Abigail had always been respected as a teacher, and Lucas had earned the community's gratitude for his role in ending Warner's tyranny. A few raised eyebrows at the speed of their attachment were silenced by Eleanor's firm defense of the couple's integrity and character. One crisp November afternoon, as they walked along Dusty Creek itself, for which the town was named, Lucas brought up a subject that had been on his mind. I received a telegram from Marshal Davis yesterday, he began, his voice carefully neutral. The trial date has been set for February. They want me in Santa Fe by January to help prepare the case. Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. That's only 2 months away. Yes, he took her hand, his much larger one enveloping hers completely. Abigail, I've been thinking a great deal about what happens after the trial. She nodded, trying to prepare herself for what might come next, a gentle letdown, perhaps, or a suggestion of a long-distance courtship while he returned to his regular duties. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Do you remember I mentioned once that I had plans for a ranch in Colorado? Yes, she said, puzzled by the apparent change of subject. I still own the land, he explained. 500 acres near a growing town called Silver Springs. I purchased it years ago, intending to settle there eventually. There's a house, nothing fancy, but solid and good grazing land. Lucas, are you saying? I'm saying I've requested a permanent reassignment to the district that includes Silver Springs, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. And I'm saying that the town needs a teacher for its growing population of children. And I'm saying, he took a deep breath, I'm saying that I love you, Abigail Montgomery, and I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. The directness of his declaration left her momentarily speechless. Love. He loved her. The realization that she felt the same way had been growing in her for weeks, but hearing him say the words made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Silver Springs, she repeated, trying to imagine it. That would mean leaving Dusty Creek, everything I've known. I know it's a lot to ask, he acknowledged, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face. You've worked so hard to rebuild here, and I wouldn't ask you to abandon that if your heart is set on staying." She thought about Dusty Creek, the community that had stood by silently while she was dragged to an auction block. The town so thoroughly corrupted by Warner's influence that it would take years to fully recover. She had stayed out of principle, out of determination not to be driven away, but was that enough reason to forego a future with this man she had come to love? "What about your work as a marshal?" she asked. "Would you continue that in Silver Springs?" He nodded. "For a time, yes. But the assignment would be more settled, less traveling, more focused on maintaining order in an established jurisdiction rather than chasing outlaws across territories. And eventually," he hesitated, "eventually, I'd like to transition fully to ranching. Build something that lasts, something to pass down." The implication: children, a family, a legacy, warmed her heart. "Tell me more about Silver Springs," she requested. "What kind of place is it?" Relief evident in his expression, Lucas described the growing town, its location in a fertile valley, the mix of ranching and mining that sustained it, the community's commitment to education and culture, unusual for a frontier settlement. As he spoke, Abigail could picture it, could see herself teaching there, building a home with Lucas, starting a new chapter far from the shadows of Dusty Creek. "It sounds wonderful," she said when he finished. "And yes, Lucas Preston, I love you too, and I would be honored to build a life with you in Silver Springs." The joy that transformed his features was worth any uncertainty she might have felt. He lifted her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of promises and possibilities, of a future neither had dared imagine months ago. They agreed to keep their plans relatively private until after the holidays, not wanting to disrupt the school term or create uncertainty for the children. But they began making preparations, Lucas corresponding with contacts in Silver Springs about teaching positions and housing arrangements, Abigail carefully sorting through her father's belongings to determine what to keep and what to sell. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with unusual festivity that year, the town celebrating its first holiday season free of Warner's influence. Abigail organized a school pageant that drew the entire community, and Lucas surprised the children with candy and small toys he had ordered specially from Denver. On Christmas Eve, after the celebrations had concluded and they had returned to Alina's sitting room for hot cider, Lucas presented Abigail with a small package wrapped in silver paper. "Merry Christmas," he said, unusually nervous as he handed it to her. Inside was a velvet box containing a ring not ostentatious, but beautifully crafted, with a small diamond flanked by 2 sapphires. "It was my mother's," Lucas explained as Abigail stared at it in wonder. "I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person, the right moment." He took her hand, his expression solemn. "Abigail Montgomery, will you marry me? Not just come to Silver Springs with me, but be my wife, my partner in everything life brings us." Tears of joy welling in her eyes, Abigail nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Alina, who had discreetly remained in the room as propriety demanded, clapped her hands in delight. "Well, it's about time. I've been watching you 2 dance around this for weeks." They laughed, and Lucas slipped the ring onto Abigail's finger, a perfect fit that seemed symbolic of how naturally they had come together despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. With their engagement official, they announced their plans to the town after the new year. There was genuine happiness from most quarters, though a few expressed disappointment that Abigail would be leaving just as the school was becoming re-established. To address this, she worked with the town council to identify and recruit a suitable replacement, eventually securing a promising young teacher from Denver who would arrive in time for the spring term. January arrived all too quickly, bringing with it Lucas's departure for Santa Fe. The separation would be their first since his arrival in Dusty Creek, and both approached it with mixed emotions. "It's only for a few weeks," Lucas reassured her the night before his departure. "Once the trial begins, you'll join me in Santa Fe to give your testimony, and then we'll go to Silver Springs together," she finished for him, trying to focus on the future rather than the impending separation. "As husband and wife, if you're willing," he added, kissing her hand where his mother's ring now rested. "We could be married in Santa Fe after the trial concludes." The idea appealed to Abigail, starting their new life together immediately, without returning to Dusty Creek with all its complicated memories. "I'd like that," she agreed. "A new beginning in every way." Their parting the next morning was difficult but softened by the certainty of reunion. Abigail threw herself into final preparations, closing up her father's house, which she had decided to sell, organizing her belongings for transport to Silver Springs, and ensuring a smooth transition for the new teacher. 3 weeks later, she received the summons she had been expecting. The trial was proceeding, and her testimony would be required the following week. Eleanor insisted on accompanying her to Santa Fe, declaring that a proper chaperone was essential for a young woman traveling to meet her fiancé, regardless of the circumstances. The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days by stagecoach, the winter landscape stark but beautiful as they traveled. Abigail alternated between excitement at seeing Lucas again and apprehension about facing Warner in court, reliving the humiliation of that day on the auction block. Lucas was waiting for them when the stagecoach arrived in Santa Fe, his face lighting up at the sight of Abigail descending from the vehicle. Propriety prevented more than a brief embrace in the public square, but his eyes conveyed everything words could not. "You're here," he said simply, as if her presence was still somewhat miraculous to him. "How was your journey?" "Long," Abigail admitted, "but worth it." Eleanor cleared her throat meaningfully. "Perhaps we could continue this reunion somewhere warmer. An old woman's bones aren't what they used to be." Lucas apologized and quickly escorted them to a small hotel near the courthouse where he had arranged accommodations. Over dinner in the hotel's restaurant, he updated them on the trial's progress. "Warner's looking at 20 years at least," he reported. "The evidence is overwhelming, and several of his associates have testified against him in exchange for reduced sentences." "How did he seem?" Abigail asked, unable to suppress her curiosity about the man who had nearly destroyed her life. Lucas considered the question. "Smaller," he said finally. "Without his power, his money, his influence. He's just a desperate man facing the consequences of his actions." The description was oddly comforting. In her mind, Warner had loomed as a nearly invincible force, his reach extending everywhere. To know that he had been reduced to an ordinary criminal somehow diminished the power he had held over her thoughts. The following day, Abigail gave her testimony before the territorial court, recounting the events leading to her near auction with a composure that surprised even herself. Warner, seated at the defense table, avoided her gaze throughout, his once commanding presence diminished by prison clothes and the weight of inevitable conviction. When she described Lucas's intervention, his bold declaration that "this ends right now," and his production of evidence contradicting Warner's claims, several jurors nodded approvingly. The defense attorney made only token attempts to challenge her account, recognizing that aggressive questioning of a sympathetic witness would only damage his client's already tenuous position. After she was dismissed from the witness stand, Lucas met her outside the courtroom, pride evident in his expression. "You were magnificent," he told her quietly. Dignified, clear, compelling. It was easier than I expected, she confessed, seeing him there defeated. It took away the power he's held in my mind all these months. The trial concluded the following week with Warner's conviction on all counts. The judge, citing the particularly egregious nature of his crimes, sentenced him to 25 years in the territorial prison, effectively a life sentence for a man of his age. As Warner was led from the courtroom, he finally looked directly at Abigail and Lucas, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't justice," he spat. "This is persecution by federal tyrants and their lackeys." Lucas's arm tightened around Abigail's shoulders. "This is exactly what justice looks like," he replied evenly. "Accountability for those who believe they are above the law." With the trial concluded, they turned their attention to more pleasant matters, specifically their wedding. Alina took charge of the arrangements with enthusiastic efficiency, enlisting the help of the hotel proprietor's wife and several local ladies she had befriended during their stay. "Nothing elaborate," Abigail insisted when Alina began talking of elaborate gowns and extensive guest lists. "Something simple, meaningful, with just those who matter most." In the end, they settled on a ceremony in the small chapel adjacent to the courthouse, with Marshall Davis serving as Lucas's best man and Alina standing up for Abigail. The hotel chef prepared a special dinner for the small gathering, and the proprietor's wife contributed a beautifully decorated cake. On the morning of the wedding, Alina helped Abigail dress in a gown of ivory silk, not new, but lovingly altered by a local seamstress to fit current fashion while remaining elegantly understated. For something old, she wore her mother's pearl earrings. For something borrowed, Alina's lace handkerchief. For something blue, a ribbon securing a lock of her hair. And for something new, the silver bracelet Lucas had given her as a wedding gift the night before. "Your father would be so proud," Alina said, adjusting Abigail's veil with tears in her eyes. "Not just of how beautiful you look today, but of the strength you've shown through everything." Abigail embraced the older woman who had become a surrogate mother to her these past months. "Thank you for everything, Alina. I don't know how I would have managed without you." "You would have managed just fine," Alina assured her. "You're stronger than you know, but I'm glad I could be there to help." The ceremony itself was brief but deeply meaningful. The chapel filled with afternoon sunlight that streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the simple altar. When Abigail entered on Marshall Davis's arm, he having gallantly offered to give her away, the look on Lucas's face was one she knew she would remember all her days: wonder and love and certainty, all combined in an expression that told her, more than any words could, that this man was truly her partner for life. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but they had each written personal promises that they shared during a quiet moment in the ceremony. Lucas spoke of protection and partnership, of building a life of meaning and purpose together. Abigail promised understanding and support, commitment to their shared dreams and respect for individual strengths. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public declaration of their bond that brought applause from their small gathering of witnesses. Abigail found herself laughing with pure joy as they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Preston. The celebration afterward was intimate and joyful, with toasts and stories shared over excellent food and wine. Marshall Davis revealed previously untold tales of Lucas's exploits as a lawman that had Abigail alternately amazed and concerned about the risks he had taken. Alina countered with childhood stories about Abigail that had Lucas grinning at his bride's early determination and spirit. As evening approached, they bid farewell to their guests, ready to begin the next chapter of their journey. They would depart for Silver Springs the following morning. Lucas had arranged for a private carriage rather than the public stagecoach, a wedding gift that would allow them to travel in comfort and privacy. Their wedding night was spent in the finest suite the hotel offered, a luxury neither had experienced before. The initial shyness between them soon gave way to the deeper connection they had been building since that first kiss in the schoolroom. Their union, a natural extension of the trust and love they had developed. Lucas proved as gentle and considerate in this aspect of marriage as he had been in all others, and Abigail discovered a passionate nature within herself that responded to his with equal fervor. The journey to Silver Springs took 5 days, the winter landscape gradually giving way to the higher elevations of central Colorado. They traveled by day and stayed at small inns along the route each night, luxuriating in the privacy and intimacy of their new status as husband and wife. Lucas told Abigail more about his past during these days of travel, about his parents who had died in a fever outbreak when he was 16, his brief service in the Union Army during the final months of the Civil War, and his drift westward afterward, seeking purpose and eventually finding it in law enforcement. "I never expected to find this kind of happiness," he confessed one night as they lay together in the darkness of a roadside inn. "After so many years alone, I had convinced myself that the solitary life was my destiny." Abigail traced the scar on his side that her father had tended years ago. "Perhaps everything that happened, even the awful parts, was leading us to each other." He kissed her then, a silent affirmation of this perspective that found meaning even in suffering and loss. Silver Springs came into view on the afternoon of the 5th day, a thriving town nestled in a valley between snow-capped mountains, larger than Dusty Creek, but with the same frontier energy. Main Street featured a mix of wooden and brick buildings, including a substantial schoolhouse that immediately caught Abigail's attention. But it was the ranch that truly took her breath away when they reached it an hour later. Situated on a gentle rise overlooking a meandering creek, the house was larger than Lucas had described, a 2-story structure of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it stood a barn and several outbuildings, and beyond stretched acres of grazing land, currently dusted with snow but promising abundant spring growth. "Lucas," she breathed as he helped her down from the carriage, "it's beautiful." His expression was a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "It needs work, been mostly unoccupied except for a caretaker checking in occasionally, but the bones are good." "It's perfect," she assured him, taking in the panoramic view of mountains and valley. "Absolutely perfect." He swept her into his arms then, carrying her across the threshold of their new home with a grin that made him look younger than she had ever seen him. Inside, he had arranged for basic provisions and necessities to be stocked, and a fire had been lit in the main fireplace, welcoming them with warmth and light. They spent that first evening exploring the house together, planning renovations and improvements, imagining where furniture would go and how spaces might be used. Lucas had shipped most of Abigail's belongings ahead, and they discovered the crates waiting in what would become their parlor: books, personal treasures, and mementos of her life in Dusty Creek. "Tomorrow we'll go into town," Lucas promised as they prepared for bed. "Meet some of the neighbors, visit the school. The principal is eager to meet you. They've been making do with temporary teachers since autumn." Abigail nodded, excitement building at the prospect of a new community to serve, new children to teach. "And your position with the marshal's office?" "I report in next week," he said. "It's as I described, more administrative, less traveling. I'll be home most nights." The word home resonated between them, carrying weight and meaning beyond its simple syllable. This was truly their home now, not a temporary arrangement or a provisional solution, but the foundation of the life they were building together. The following months were busy with establishing themselves in Silver Springs. Abigail took up her teaching position at the town school, quickly winning the respect of students and parents alike with her innovative methods and genuine care for her pupils. Lucas divided his time between his duties as deputy marshal and beginning improvements on the ranch, hiring local men to help with repairs to outbuildings and fences in preparation for eventually stocking the land with cattle. They became part of the community, attending church socials, hosting occasional dinners for neighbors, contributing to town improvement projects. Lucas's reputation as a fair-minded lawman earned him the respect of the townspeople, while Abigail's dedication to education made her a valued addition to Silver Springs' growing emphasis on cultural development. By summer, they had settled into a comfortable routine that balanced their professional responsibilities with their life together at the ranch, which they had named Montgomery Ridge in honor of Abigail's father. The house had been transformed through their joint efforts, Lucas handling structural improvements, Abigail creating a warm, inviting interior that reflected both their tastes. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Abigail turned to her husband with news she had been saving for this quiet moment. "Lucas," she began, taking his hand, "I visited Dr. Hoffman today." His expression immediately turned concerned. "Are you unwell? You seem tired lately, but I thought it was just the heat and end-of-term examinations." She smiled, squeezing his hand reassuringly. "Not unwell exactly, just expecting." It took a moment for her meaning to register, and then his face transformed with wonder. "Expecting, you mean?" "A baby," she confirmed, joy bubbling through her words. "Our baby, due in February according to the doctor." Lucas stared at her in amazement before gathering her gently into his arms, mindful now of her condition. "A baby," he repeated, as if testing the reality of the word. "We're going to be parents." The awe in his voice matched the feelings in her own heart. This new life they had created together was the culmination of all they had built since that fateful day in Dusty Creek nearly a year ago. "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he answered, his hand moving to rest protectively over her still flat abdomen. "Grateful, humbled, terrified in the best possible way." They sat together as darkness fell, planning and dreaming a nursery in the room adjacent to theirs, adjustments to their schedules once the baby arrived, hopes for this child who would grow up in the freedom and beauty of Montgomery Ridge. The months of Abigail's pregnancy passed with a mixture of anticipation and preparation. Lucas became even more protective, insisting on hiring help for the house and arranging for a substitute teacher to take over Abigail's classes after Christmas. Their circle of friends in Silver Springs provided support and advice, especially the wives of Lucas's colleagues who had children of their own. Letters from Alina arrived regularly, full of excitement about her impending status as honorary grandmother. She promised to visit in the spring, once travel was easier and the baby had arrived. As Abigail's February due date approached, a sense of completion settled over Montgomery Ridge. The nursery was ready, with a cradle Lucas had crafted himself from pine harvested on their land. The ranch was becoming more established, with a small herd of cattle now grazing in the lower pastures and plans for expansion in the coming year. On a snowy night in mid-February, almost exactly a year after their wedding in Santa Fe, Abigail's labor began. Lucas rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from town, returning to find his wife pacing the bedroom, determined and focused despite her pain. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day, Lucas remaining by Abigail's side, despite the midwife's initial suggestion that he wait elsewhere. "My place is here," he insisted, supporting Abigail physically and emotionally through each contraction, his strength never wavering even as concern for her suffering showed in his eyes. As afternoon light filled the room, their son entered the world with a robust cry that brought tears to both parents' eyes. Daniel Lucas Preston, named for both their fathers, had his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's determined chin, a perfect blend of their features that seemed to embody the union of their lives. "He's perfect," Lucas whispered, holding his son for the first time while Abigail rested against the pillows, exhausted but radiant. "Absolutely perfect." Abigail watched her husband cradle their child with such tender care. This man who had once made his living confronting the most dangerous elements of frontier society, now completely captivated by 7 pounds of newborn humanity. The contrast highlighted everything she loved about him, his capacity for both strength and gentleness, protection and nurturing. "We've come so far," she murmured, reaching for his hand. "From that terrible day in Dusty Creek to this perfect one." Lucas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, positioning himself so both wife and son were within his embrace. "That day changed everything," he agreed. "The moment I saw you on that auction block, something inside me shifted. I'd gone there to fulfill a promise to your father, to right a legal wrong, but what I found was the beginning of our story." Abigail thought back to those words that had changed her fate. "This ends right now," spoken by a dust-covered stranger who would become the center of her world. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you had arrived just a few minutes later?" she asked. "I try not to," he admitted, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "But I know this: I would have found you, Abigail. Somehow our paths were meant to cross." Looking down at their sleeping son, secure in his father's protective hold, Abigail felt a sense of completion that transcended the challenges and sorrows that had preceded this moment. From the grief of her father's death and the humiliation of Warner's scheme had come this new life, not just Daniel's, but the life she and Lucas had built together at Montgomery Ridge, in this community that had welcomed them so warmly. "I love you," she said simply, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw, now softened by emotion. "And I'm so grateful for every step of this journey, even the painful ones, because they led us here." "I love you too," he replied, leaning down to kiss her with infinite tenderness. "More than I ever thought possible." As twilight descended on Montgomery Ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of purple and deep blue, the three Prestons remained nestled together in the warmth of their home, a family forged through unexpected circumstances, bound by love that had found them when they least expected it, and strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect that would sustain them through all the years to come. Daniel would eventually be joined by 2 sisters, Alina Elaine, born 2 years later, and Julia Grace, who arrived 3 years after that. The Preston children grew up in the freedom of Montgomery Ridge, surrounded by the beauty of the Colorado mountains and the love of parents who never took their happiness for granted. Lucas gradually transitioned from law enforcement to ranching as the children grew, building Montgomery Ridge into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. Abigail continued teaching until their 3rd child was born, then focused on educating their own children and establishing a small library in Silver Springs that became a center for community learning. They never forgot how their story began with an auction block, a courageous stand, and words that had changed two lives forever. Each anniversary of that day, they would share a private toast to remember the moment when fate and choice had intersected to begin their journey together. And sometimes, when visitors asked how they had met, they would exchange a meaningful glance before Lucas would say, with simple truth that concealed as much as it revealed, "I saw her standing alone, surrounded by danger, and I knew right then that I had to speak up. That moment changed everything." Abigail would smile at this understated description, knowing that only they fully understood the depth of what had happened that day in Dusty Creek, how close she had come to a fate unimaginable, and how completely one man's determination had altered the course of her life. "This ends right now," he had declared on that dusty afternoon in Arizona territory. And indeed, it had ended the danger, the fear, the isolation. But something else had begun in that same moment, a love story that would unfold across decades, weathering challenges and celebrating joys, always grounded in the certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most.